Good afternoon. Today our guest is famous American falconer, Colonel Kent Carnie, founder and honorable president of Archives of Falconry in Boise, Idaho State, in the United States of America. And everybody knows Kent Carnie as a keen falconer, and in this aspect we would like to ask him to tell how he became falconer since his childhood. So, word is for you, please.
Certainly, yeah. It's interesting because when I was 10 years old, my family rented a place in the mountains. And my parents would come up on the weekends, and I lived in this mountain cabin for all through the summer with my grandmother. And the man who lived next door to us had a falcon. He was a beginner. He knew almost nothing about it, but of course he knew a great deal more than I did. But he had a couple of hawks. And at the age of 10, I saw these birds, and my heart was, that was it. You know, I've never looked back. So I saw the first birds I ever saw, falconry, or heard about it when I was 10. It was not until I was 14 that I got my first bird, but even then, I have been at it ever since.
And who was this bird?
The man's name was Grant Orme, O-R-M-E, and then I never heard anything more about him. I found his name once later in an old falconry list of members of an old club, but no one ever heard of him, and I've never heard from him or about him ever since. But which is unfortunate, and I don't know how deeply he was involved in the sport. He didn't know a lot about it. He was just beginning, but his beginning was my beginning. So.
And which literature sources you could use in that time, because it was not numerous.
No.
Very sketchy.
But by the time I was 14 or 15, we lived down the peninsula from the city of San Francisco, and we would go down and get on the train and take the train to San Francisco, which was about an hour and 15 minutes. And a couple of us that were interested. On a Saturday morning, we would go up there, and there's a kind of not a very pleasant neighborhood, but there were some old magazine and bookstores. And we haunted those old bookstores, and we looked and looked, and we came to understand, as soon as we got in high school, secondary school, that there is a document or the book in the United States called The Reader's Guide of Periodical Literature, and it's an index of all the magazine articles. And we all go to, we learned about this. First thing, falconry, there we go. And there was an article written by a man, the most famous American bird artist of the first quarter of the 19th century, named Louis Agassiz Fuertes. And in the World War, the First War, why he had been doing a series of magazine articles, and his the money was hard to come by, and he was offered he got some photographs from a friend in Holland showing falconry. So he took these photographs and did some research and wrote an article called Falconry, the Sport of Kings. And it appeared in the December 1920 issue of the National Geographic magazine. And like so many other young falconers at that point, that sold. I mean, it was the Bible. That was the thing. And we'd look for that. And we want more than one copy because it has beautiful color pictures that he had painted on both sides, so you get two copies so you can cut them out and put both of them on your wall. And we were all just nuts. And we were able to run down other old articles like that. And one of these was an article in a magazine called Popular Mechanics, and it talked about falconry, and they said there was a falconry club in America that had just been formed, which is the Falconers Association of North America, founded about 1943. And so on one of these trips to the old bookstores. I walked in and I said, I would like copies of the American Falconer, please. Do you have any? And the man came out with the first 6 that had ever been published. I could have gone into a million other bookstores and never found it. But what kind of luck had anything to do with it, I don't know. But there he was. He had the whole thing, all 6 that had been published to that point. And that was a big excitement, because also in that was a list of members. And I look, and 50 miles away from where I lived was one of the members. And so we went and looked up this old gentleman and established a relationship, and we bothered him for the rest of the time we were growing up. We would go on a Saturday and land on this poor man in his small house and eat him out of house and home and talk hawks all day. Eat him at dinner. Put the sleeping bags on the floor, sleep there at night, wake up in the morning, eat them some more. At Sunday night we'd go home, go back to home and back to school. But we bothered this man, something awful, and he was very, very generous with his time, and he was a grand person and had a big influence on us, because he not only taught us how to tie a jess or make a hood, but he taught us a lot about the aesthetics and the ethics and the heritage of falconry that is so important.
You published a couple of years ago very serious, thick book about history of
Yes.
American falconry.
Yes.
And so, avoiding some repetition, well, I would like to ask you to tell a little bit about your year spent in Iran, when probably you also were true to falconry.
Well, yes, in university I studied wildlife management, but I soon learned about what they call biopolitics, and not always does the best biologist get the proper job. And I came to the conclusion that I would look for another field, and I would use falconry, or my biology and my interest in raptors, as a hobby. And my father had been an Army person, and I had friends there that were going into the Army, so I joined the Army when I graduated from college. And it turned out that in the Army, where they had a program, and in those days, this was in the early 1950s, we're bound to go to war with Russia. And if we go to war with Russia, we must get to Russia. And so we're going to have to fight through some other countries. So they had a program where they would pick an Army officer or two, once or twice, or once a year, or every 2 years, and he would be expected to learn all about one of these countries on the periphery of Russia. And so that if we went to war, and that was the way we went into Russia, you had a commander who had somebody on his staff who knew all about the heritage. Well, one of the books that my old mentor frequently, I mean, when we were asking questions, he would stop and he would, my son, and then he would answer, and he quoting Timur Mirza and the Persian treatise on falconry, the Bazname. And with that, I became entranced with Persian falconry. Mm-hmm. So, in the Army, they have this special program you can sign up for. And one of the countries was Iran, Persia. So I signed up for Iran, and I went, they sent me to the Army Language School for a year, they sent me to graduate school at Princeton, and then they said, go to Iran, absorb the total culture, come back in 2 years. So I was in Iran for 2 years after that, and I kept following it. I kept looking for falconers everywhere I went. Where's the falcons? Where are the falconers? And everybody said, that was nice. We know all about that. But my grandfather used to do that, But we don't do that anymore. So there, I found very, very few falconers there. I did find a very, very avid, active falconer, and he was as crazy about falconry as any of us, named Abdul Majid Nasrollahi. and he was a lieutenant general in the Iranian army, and after he retired, he became the Governor General of Baluchistan at the appointment of the Shah. But so I established a friendship with him. I saw his birds fly. I learned some things about Persian ethics. For example, you don't admire something that an Iranian has, or he wants to give it to you. You know, if you, oh, what a lovely tie you have. Please, it's yours, you know. And on one occasion, not having learned that yet, I was really awestruck. A beautiful intermewed female goshawk that he had. And oh, what a lovely bird, oh, please, take her, he said to me. And I knew I could not take the bird. I mean, taking the bird would be like taking his child. So I learned a lot about ethics there, but I learned that, you know, you cannot, be careful what you ask for, you might get it. Mm-hmm. But he was a very, very bright falconer. It was an interesting occasion because I had recently republished Simon Latham's treatise on falconry. And so when I went to visit the general the first time, I took him a copy that I had reprinted of Simon Latham. And I told him that this is one of the books in English language that we think is one of the best for long wings, and I'd like you to have this. And he thanked me very much. And he said, let me show you the book that I have, that I think is the best. And so he disappeared from the room, and he comes back. He's got a book all wrapped in a silk handkerchief, and I'm thinking, here is a gold-bound copy of the Basnameh with jewels in it and all that. And he opens the package. It's E.B. Mitchell, The Art and Practice of Hawking, mm-hmm. which is a great book. I mean, of all the things that he could have said, he really showed me he had an understanding. But as I say, I was expecting some exotic Persian treatise, and he turns up with mm-hmm. E.B. Mitchell. Mm-hmm. So I did that. I was on duty at the same time, so I didn't have a lot of hunting experience. I had a bird or two, but it was difficult to hunt and get the time to do that. I did have an interesting incident. I spent some time at the head of the Persian Gulf. I would go back and forth from my office in Tehran, mm-hmm. and the Iranians that I worked with on the Persian Gulf knew I was interested in falconry. And so one day after my visit, they walked in with a sacret and said, here, please take this. It's a present from us. Great, but I have an airplane to fly back and whatever. And but this is Iran, this is the Middle East, you know. So I went to the airport with the sacret on the fist and got my ticket, have it already. And the airport pointed at the bird and said, no, you can't do that. And they were quite upset. And so I told them, you know, the circumstances and whatever. They weren't upset at me taking the bird. They were upset because it didn't have a hood on. Mm-hmm. If it had been hooded, it would have been fine. Mm-hmm. But in the long run, they let me take it back with me. Mm-hmm. So that was a fun experience in Iran. I took the cigarette back, and eventually, good heavens, I think I sent it to Jeffrey Pollard. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I had all sorts of occasions. I had a Shaheen. I went to India. I went walking across the Punjab for about a week, trapping with a fellow named Jerry Anderson, who was an old member of the British Falconers Club, an Anglo-Indian gentleman, and he was a middleman in the early days. He would get the sakers from the trappers in the Punjab and sell them to the Arabs. Mm-hmm. And so we went up with some of his trappers and we saw some birds trapped and whatever. But we were there and we went to Muhammad Din in Lahore, and I've got a picture of us there with the floor just covered with hawking bells, mm-hmm. where he had all these things there. And I bought a black Shaheen, which I brought back again on an airplane, no problem. But I was traveling and then in Iran with that Shaheen, and I was seated on an aisle seat, and across the aisle from me was another gentleman. And unfortunately, I had fed the Shaheen too much, and in the midst of the flight, hoists its tail right down the side of this gentleman's. I mean, he was all well dressed, blue suit, tie, the whole 9 yards. Oh, what am I going to do, you know? And I got out my handkerchief and I called for a towel. No, don't touch it, don't touch it, don't touch it. And
Real gentleman.
pardon me?
A real
He
gentleman.
was a real gentleman,
Yes.
absolutely. But don't. And finally, at the end of the flight, he took out a penknife. And by that time, the mute had dried, and he scraped it off the side of his trousers. He knew exactly how to get rid of that. He knew more about falconry than I thought he did. But it was a grand trip. And I had some lovely experiences over there, and look upon Iran as my second country, really. But it's unfortunate that the politics today are the way they are.
Since we are sitting today in Posadas,
Yes.
in the north of Argentina,
Yeah, yes.
could you tell please briefly about your earliest links with South American falconers?
I had no links with South American falconers. I struggled with the literature in writing the history book that I wrote. I had some friends in Spain who gave me some help, and we had some ladies working in the Peregrine Fund who spoke Spanish that could interpret some of these things or translate these things. But for the most part, I knew nothing about falconry in South America. I did, when I retired, I spent 2 years traveling back and forth between hawking grouse in Scotland and doing a peregrine survey in Iran. And after that 2 years was up, we came back and we lived in Mexico. So I had some connections with Mexican falconry, but Mexican falconry in those days, 1974, 76, it was brand new. And they were new, and it was a situation where I was a little bit leery because the laws and the legal situation in Mexico are such that I was afraid that if someone took a liking to my falcon, someone would pay a little more deed, the policeman would come and I would lose my falcons. So I didn't have that much contact with the Mexican falconry community, but there was almost none at that time. This was 74, and I had been in Mexico City in 72, representing NAFA at a wildlife conference, and I had met a Mexican falconer, Roberto Bejar Calderon, who was sort of the grand old man of falconry at that time. And on that visit in 1972, he invited me to his lovely home, and we had a party with a bunch of young Mexicans that were interested in falconry, but not much experience, because at that time I was living on my last military duty assignment in Texas, and I had a lovely opportunity. I had a big goshawk, and I was catching hares, jackrabbits. So when I went to Mexico City, I took a book of photographs of those things and took it to Roberto Bejar Calderon and showed him at this party. And all these kids were awestruck. They looked at those pictures of the goshawk chasing the hares and went. The interesting thing was they would not believe these were wild rabbits. So it gives you some idea of the status of Mexican falconry in 1972.
And which hawks did you fly during your career in falconry?
In falconry, I tried to fly a number of birds and did not do well at it. Interestingly, while I was taking the Persian language course, I got a Passage Merlin, which I flew successfully, but when you're taking that language course, you don't, you can't be distracted. So
Yes.
I turned that little bird loose. It was a Passage hawk. And after my time in Iran, I got into goshawks. I had Cooper's hawks as a young man in college and whatever, and they drove me crazy. I mean, a Cooper's hawk is a psychotic bird if ever there was one, and I swore I'd never have another shortwing. But then I found that goshawks were different than Cooper's hawks, and I got a goshawk, a Passage hawk, and had a lot of fun with it, catching rabbits. And then eventually I had, some years later, had a lovely big Finnish Passage female, and that was the bird I took to El Paso and we caught jackrabbits very successfully with that for 2 seasons while I was there. And but more and more I was edging toward the long wings. I mean, I'd had a prairie falcon or whatever as a kid, but not with much success. So about 1976, I got very serious about it. I was out of the service. I was retired. I had the time, and I brought it after these bird things that I told you about, the bird studies I was doing in Iran. I brought 2 passage peregrines back from Iran, and I flew those in Mexico, and then brought them up to the States and flew them there. I was flying ducks because I felt I could fly ducks by myself. I had myself and a dog, and that was it. And I did not think, I had hawked for a number of years. I had made the acquaintance and friendship of Geoffrey Pollard, who was a pioneer British grouse hawker. And so I'd been hawking several seasons with Geoffrey, but I thought it took an establishment like Geoffrey with a number of birds and a bunch of dogs and people to help handle the dogs and all. So that's why I chose ducks. But I got into grouse, and I found that I was able to fly grouse on my own. And so I took to specializing in, we found lesser prairie chickens in New Mexico, and then I flew sharp-tailed grouse in Montana. And I would leave home the 1st of September and in Montana, and would hawk until our Thanksgiving, which is at the end of November, when we would go to the NAFA meet, the North American Falcon Association meet, have a meeting, and then from then I would go to southern New Mexico and Texas, where we had lesser prairie chickens, and I would hawk until the end of March. So I was gone 6 months of the year, which probably accounts for why I've had more than one wife. But so I flew prairie grouse, sharptails in Montana, although we killed sage grouse, we killed pheasants, we killed huns, ducks. But basically I was interested in sharp-tailed grouse in Montana and lesser prairie chickens in New Mexico. And I was flying first peregrines that I brought back from Iran, and then in 1982, Jim Weaver in the Peregrine Fund, on whose board I was serving at the time, Jim gave me an IS hybrid gerfalcon peregrine female, which I had for the following 18 years. She punctured an eyeball chasing a prairie chicken into a mesquite bush and lost her depth perception in one eye, which threw off her grouse hawking. So she was a pensioner after about her first 10 years. But we did very, very well for 10 years, and then I